On the morning of August 16, 1937, the atmosphere atop the Santa Lucia Range was thick with a heavy Pacific fog that clung to the Mediterranean towers of San Simeon. Inside the Gothic study, the air was scented with the sharp, resinous aroma of cedar logs burning in a 16th century French fireplace. William Randolph Hearst, the man who for 5 decades had manufactured the reality of the American public, sat encased in a high-backed walnut chair. He was surrounded by over 7,000 volumes of rare manuscripts and primary historical records, including the original architectural drawings of European cathedrals. The only sound in the cavernous room was the rhythmic, mechanical chatter of a teletype Model 15, its metal hammers striking ribbon and paper with the cold precision of a countdown. The message surfacing from the machine was not a dispatch regarding a foreign war or a political assassination. It was a forensic summary of his own financial expiration. At 74 years of age, Hearst, the proprietor of 28 major newspapers, 13 magazines, and 8 radio stations, was facing a total collapse of liquidity. In 1930, his net worth had been estimated at $140 million. In the purchasing power of 2026, that figure scales to approximately $2.6 billion. Yet his obsession with tangible assets had left him cash poor during a catastrophic contraction of the American economy. The Roosevelt recession of 1937 had seen industrial production drop by 30%, and the Revenue Act of 1935, often called the Wealth Tax Act, had raised the top marginal tax rate to 79%. For Hearst, these were not just statistics. They were the walls of a closing trap. The technical logistics of his estate were staggering. San Simeon, known as La Cuesta Encantada, required a permanent staff of 30 area maintenance workers just to manage the plumbing and electrical systems of the 115-room main house, Casa Grande. The building was a marvel of reinforced concrete engineering, designed by Julia Morgan to withstand the seismic activity of the San Andreas Fault, located only a few miles to the northeast. But the cost of maintaining this fortress was now exceeding the revenue generated by the Hearst Corporation's dwindling advertising sales. His debt had reached $126 million, nearly $2.4 billion in 2026 dollars. The banks, led by the Chase National Bank of New York, had finally revoked his autonomy. Earlier that morning, his lead trustee, Clarence Shern, had arrived with a team of forensic accountants. Their mission was to begin the systematic cataloging of the Hearst collection for liquidation. They moved through the refectory, noting the value of the 16th century Flemish tapestries and the Baccarat Harcourt glassware on the 400-year-old monastery tables. Each piece of silver, bearing the hallmarks of 18th century London smiths, was cross-referenced with purchase ledgers. Hearst's collection was so vast that it occupied 2 entire warehouses in New York and several others in London, containing everything from entire Spanish cloisters to Egyptian mummies. This was the silence of a god-king stripped of his lightning. Hearst's power had always been based on the ability to spend without consequence. He had lived by the rule that an image or a headline was more real than a fact, but the mathematics of the 1930s were immune to his editorial spin. The man who had once triggered the Spanish-American War to boost the circulation of the New York Journal was now unable to pay the electricity bill for his own private zoo. As he stared at the teletype, the realization took hold. The only narrative he could not rewrite was the one dictated by the cold black ink of a bank's ledger. The master of manipulation was finally trapped in a house of stone, built with money that no longer existed. But to understand how Hearst arrived at this golden abyss, one must look past the ruins of 1937 and into the dust of the Nevada silver mines. The foundation of his arrogance was not built on paper, but on the raw, violent extraction of wealth from the earth itself. William Randolph Hearst was not an architect of his own fortune. He was the beneficiary of the most lucrative silver strike in American history. His father, George Hearst, was a self-taught geologist and miner who secured a 1/6 interest in the Comstock lode in 1859. The technical reality of the Comstock was brutal. It required the Washoe process, a complex chemical extraction method involving mercury, salt, and copper sulfate to separate silver from the quartz ore. By the time Willie was born in 1863, George Hearst was generating wealth at a rate equivalent to $34,000 per hour in 2026 currency. Young Hearst grew up in a world where geography was something his father bought and reshaped. He witnessed the power of the square-set timbering system, a mining technique that allowed for deeper, more dangerous excavations, fueling the Gilded Age's insatiable demand for bullion. While other sons of the elite were groomed for the Senate or the pulpit, Hearst was observing how the raw power of the Hearst silver could silence critics and purchase legislatures. His mother, Phoebe Hearst, a refined philanthropist, took him on a grand tour of Europe at age 10. It was here that his obsession with historical objects began. In 1873, he saw the ruins of the old world and realized that everything, from a Roman statue to a medieval ceiling, had a price. In 1887, after being expelled from Harvard for a series of elaborate pranks, including sending his professors chamber pots with their names inscribed on the bottom, Hearst demanded his inheritance early. He did not want the family's mining interests in the Homestake mine of South Dakota or the Anaconda copper mine in Montana. Instead, he asked for the San Francisco Examiner, a failing, debt-ridden newspaper George Hearst had acquired as a political mouthpiece. At the time, the Examiner was losing the equivalent of $500,000 a year in 2026 dollars. George Hearst viewed the request as a fool's errand, but he granted it. The technical transformation Hearst brought to the Examiner was immediate and revolutionary. He invested heavily in the Hoe octuple printing press, a massive steam-powered machine capable of printing 48,000 eight-page papers per hour. This was the cutting edge of 19th century logistics. He also overhauled the chemistry of the ink, utilizing more vibrant pigments to ensure that his crusade headlines popped against the gray competition. He understood that the Gilded Age public was bored by the dry statistical reporting of the era. He hired Ambrose Bierce, a cynical and brilliant writer, and paid him a salary that was nearly triple the industry standard. In 1887, a top reporter might earn $30 a week. Hearst paid $100, approximately $3,400 per week in 2026 value. Hearst's philosophy was simple. News was a commodity that had to be manufactured, not just found. He sent reporters to jump off boats to test rescue response times and hired specialists to stage crimes so they could be discovered by his photographers. He was converting the raw silver from his father's mines into a new kind of currency: public attention. By 1890, the Examiner's circulation had jumped from 15,000 to 60,000. He had successfully applied the aggressive, extractive techniques of the mining industry to the field of journalism. He was no longer just reporting on the world. He was mining the human psyche for outrage and excitement. George Hearst died in 1891, leaving an estate worth approximately $18 million, $615 million today, to Phoebe, not William. This left the young editor in a position of dependence, forcing him to constantly petition his mother for capital to fuel his expansion. He realized that San Francisco was a finite market. To achieve the absolute power he craved, he needed a larger stage. He needed the capital of the world. New York City in the 1890s was the ultimate prize. A dense urban jungle where the rules of the Gilded Age were being written in blood and gold. He had conquered the West with his father's silver. Now he intended to conquer the East with his own ink. But in New York, a rival awaited him who had built his own empire on the same principles of sensation and scale. The coming collision would not just change the newspaper industry, it would result in the invention of the first truly modern war. In 1895, William Randolph Hearst entered New York City not as a supplicant, but as an invading force. He purchased the struggling New York Journal for $180,000, a sum equivalent to approximately $6.9 million in 2026 currency, using a liquid cash transfer from his mother's mining dividends. His arrival triggered an immediate scorched earth circulation war with Joseph Pulitzer, the owner of the New York World. Pulitzer, a Hungarian immigrant who had revolutionized the industry with a mix of crusading reform and sensationalism, was at the time suffering from worsening retinal detachment and debilitating sound sensitivity, often retreating to soundproofed rooms. Hearst viewed Pulitzer's physical fragility as a strategic opening. To dismantle the world, Hearst began a predatory hiring campaign, poaching Pulitzer's entire Sunday staff by offering 25% salary increases and long-term guaranteed contracts. In 1896, a top-tier editor's salary of $10,000 per year was boosted to $12,500, which reflects a staggering $480,000 annual package in 2026 purchasing power. The technical pivot of this era was the introduction of the color supplement. Hearst invested in the Ho 4-color rotary press, a massive piece of industrial engineering that allowed for the mass production of the Yellow Kid comic strip. The ink used for the kid's robe required a specific, expensive, quick-drying yellow pigment that gave the era its name, yellow journalism. The logistics of the journal were managed like a military operation. By 1897, Hearst was spending $2 million annually, over $77 million today, to sustain a price war where he sold his paper for a single penny, forcing Pulitzer to do the same and bleeding both empires of their profit margins in favor of raw volume. The macroeconomic context of the late 1890s provided the fuel for Hearst's ultimate ambition. The United States was emerging from the panic of 1893 and seeking a new role on the global stage, fueled by the concept of manifest destiny. In Cuba, the rebellion against Spanish colonial rule offered Hearst the perfect narrative. He dispatched a fleet of private yachts and tugboats, equipped with onboard darkrooms and telegraphic equipment, to the Caribbean. The technical cost of a single transatlantic telegraph cable from Havana to New York was approximately $1.15 per word, which in 2026 scales to nearly $45 per word. Hearst's bills frequently exceeded $3,000 a day, $115,000 today. When the USS Maine, a second-class battleship with a displacement of 6,682 tons, exploded in Havana Harbor on February 15, 1898, Hearst did not wait for the Naval Court of Inquiry's report on the 10,000 pounds of gunpowder in the forward magazines. He immediately authorized the printing of a $50,000 reward, $1.9 million today, for the conviction of the Spanish perpetrators. The journal's coverage utilized a new form of visual manipulation. He hired the artist Frederick Remington, paying him a monthly retainer of $1,000, $38,000 today, to provide evocative sketches of Spanish atrocities. When Remington complained that there was no war to paint, Hearst's reported reply, "You furnish the pictures, and I'll furnish the war," became the mantra of his career. By March 1898, the journal's circulation hit 1 million copies a day, a logistical feat that required the use of special newsboy distribution networks and high-speed rail delivery across the Northeast. The Spanish-American War was the first conflict to be treated as a commercial product. Hearst even organized his own expeditionary force, chartering the steamer Sylvia and personally leading a team of reporters into the surf at Siboney, Cuba, armed with a revolver and a notepad. However, the manipulation of a nation's foreign policy carried a domestic price. While the war concluded with the U.S. acquisition of the Philippines, Guam, and Puerto Rico, the public began to perceive Hearst not as a patriot, but as a dangerous provocateur. He had learned that he could manufacture a war by controlling the flow of information, but he failed to realize that the same techniques could be used to target him. His ego began to expand into the realm of electoral politics, fueled by the belief that the man who made the news could also be the man who made the law. By the early 1920s, William Randolph Hearst had evolved from a mere newspaperman into the head of a vertically integrated industrial hydra. The Hearst Corporation was no longer just about ink. It was about the total control of the American sensory experience. He understood the logistical vulnerability of the paper industry and solved it by purchasing 1,000 square miles of timberland in Canada and building his own pulp mills. This gave him a forest-to-newsstand pipeline, shielding his 28 newspapers from the fluctuating costs of newsprint, which in 1922 averaged $70 per ton, amounting to $300 in 2026 dollars. This vertical integration allowed him to maintain a crushing competitive advantage during the post-WWI economic boom. His strategy for the 1920s was the Hearst synergy. When he acquired Harper's Bazaar and Cosmopolitan, he transformed them into marketing engines for his other interests. A serialized story in Cosmopolitan would be adapted into a film by his own studio, Cosmopolitan Productions, and then reviewed favorably by his 28 daily newspapers. The technical core of this era was the transition from print to the moving image. Hearst invested heavily in the chemistry of 35mm nitrate film, despite its extreme flammability. He built a massive film studio in Harlem, New York, occupying an entire city block, where he attempted to manufacture his mistress, Marion Davies, into a global icon. In 1923 alone, he spent $2 million, $37 million today, on the production of a single historical epic when knighthood was in flower, solely to showcase Davies's wardrobe, which featured authentic lace and hand-sewn jewels. The macro context of the Jazz Age provided the perfect cover for Hearst's massive accumulation of influence. The 1920s saw the rise of the star system, and Hearst was its premier architect. He used his King Features syndicate to distribute content to over 2,000 newspapers he didn't even own, effectively taxing the competition for the right to run popular features like Popeye or Flash Gordon. At the peak of this period, it was estimated that 1 in every 4 Americans received their information through a Hearst-controlled outlet. His political power was equally immense. He was instrumental in the 1932 nomination of Franklin D. Roosevelt at the Democratic Convention in Chicago, trading his support and the California delegation for the placement of John Nance Garner as vice president. The secondary characters of this era, such as Adolph Zukor of Paramount Pictures and Louis B. Mayer of MGM, were both his rivals and his collaborators. They feared the Hearst blacklist, a technical ban where any actor or director who crossed Hearst would find their name omitted from all Hearst publications, effectively ending their career. Hearst's lifestyle reflected this absolute dominion. He moved his primary base of operations to a 30-room penthouse at 137 Riverside Drive in Manhattan, but even that was insufficient for his burgeoning art collection. He began the construction of the International Magazine Building on 57th Street, an Art Deco masterpiece designed by Joseph Urban, featuring 6 massive pylons representing the different sectors of his empire. The cost of the limestone and specialized masonry for this structure in 1928 was over $2 million and $37.5 million today. Yet this architecture of influence was built on a foundation of debt and personal obsession. Hearst was spending more than $15 million a year, $280 million today, on art and real estate, often outbidding the Louvre or the British Museum for medieval artifacts. He was no longer distinguishing between his personal desires and his corporate assets. He began to believe that his newspapers were not just businesses, but defensive fortifications. He had constructed a world where he was the sole arbiter of truth and beauty, but as the 1920s drew to a close, the global economy was preparing a correction that no editorial headline could forestall. While he built his walls higher, a new generation of critics was observing the cracks in the stone. By 1919, William Randolph Hearst began the transformation of his father's 250,000-acre Piedra Blanca ranch into the most expensive private residence in American history. He hired Julia Morgan, the first woman to be licensed as an architect in California and a graduate of the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. The project, which Hearst referred to simply as the ranch, was an exercise in structural excess and logistical impossibility. Over the next 28 years, Hearst would spend roughly $10 million on construction, a sum exceeding $160 million in 2026 purchasing power, not including the billions of dollars worth of art housed within its walls. The technical challenge was immense. Morgan had to design a 5-mile winding road with a 1,600-foot vertical ascent to transport 50,000 tons of materials from the San Simeon Wharf. This included massive amounts of reinforced concrete, a material Hearst favored for its fireproof qualities and its ability to withstand the seismic shifts of the nearby San Andreas Fault. The architectural centerpiece, Casa Grande, was modeled after a Spanish cathedral in Ronda. Its twin bell towers housed 36 carillon bells cast in Belgium, costing the equivalent of $1.2 million today. Inside, the technical density of the art collection was unparalleled. Hearst did not merely buy paintings, he bought environments. He purchased entire 16th century ceilings from Spanish monasteries and Italian palazzos, which Julia Morgan had to structurally integrate into the concrete framework of the house. The refectory featured silk paleo banners from Siena and a 400-year-old French fireplace that stood 2 stories tall. To manage the sheer volume of his acquisitions, Hearst maintained a 3-story, city block-sized warehouse in the Bronx, New York, where a staff of 30 permanent curators managed over 20,000 cataloged items. The logistics of moving a single 15th century choir stall from Europe to the central coast of California involved transatlantic shipping, transcontinental rail, and finally, heavy-duty Mack trucks struggling up the Santa Lucia Range. The exterior was equally engineered for spectacle. The Neptune pool was rebuilt 3 times between 1924 and 1936 to satisfy Hearst's evolving aesthetic vision. The final iteration held 345,000 gallons of water and was lined entirely with Vermont marble. It featured a complex hydraulic heating system and a filtration plant that was more advanced than most municipal water systems of the era. Surrounding the pool were authentic Roman colonnades and a 1st century AD temple facade imported from Italy. Beyond the gardens lay the largest private zoo in the world. Hearst's agents scouted the globe to purchase giraffes, zebras, polar bears, and lions. The cost of meat and specialized feed for the carnivores alone amounted to approximately $85,000 per month in 2026 currency. The zoo required a dedicated staff of veterinarians and handlers, and the fencing was designed to be virtually invisible, creating the illusion of a prehistoric, wild California. Macroeconomically, the construction of San Simeon served as a private stimulus package during the boom of the 1920s and continued even as the nation plunged into the Great Depression. While the average American worker earned roughly $1,300 a year, Hearst's master masons and carvers were paid premium wages to ensure absolute loyalty and silence. The guest list was a calculated roster of the world's elite. Figures like Winston Churchill, Calvin Coolidge, and Bernard Shaw were flown in on Hearst's private fleet of planes or arrived via his private rail car. However, the opulence was governed by an idiosyncratic and rigid social code. Despite his vast wealth, Hearst forbade the serving of hard liquor in public areas, limiting guests to wine or beer, a nod to the era of prohibition while simultaneously ignoring its restrictions. He also maintained a pathological fear of mortality. No guest or staff member was permitted to use the word death or old in his presence. The Ray created a world where time was frozen in stone, and the outside reality of a changing America was filtered through the lens of a medieval lord. Yet, as the walls of the castle rose higher, the division between his public morality and his private life began to fracture the very foundations of the empire. In the early 1920s, William Randolph Hearst maintained a duality that defined the hypocrisy of the Gilded Age elite. His wife, Millicent Wilson, a former Ziegfeld Follies performer, remained the official matriarch of the Hearst family in New York. She managed their social standing in Manhattan, presiding over the Milk Fund for Babies and other high-profile charities that maintained the Hearst name's respectability among the old money Knickerbocker set. Millicent lived in a sprawling triple penthouse at 1065th Avenue, a property currently valued at over $50 million. However, by 1917, Hearst had already begun his 34-year obsession with Marion Davies, a teenage chorus girl who would become the shadow queen of San Simeon. The technical machinery of Hearst's media empire was immediately redirected to manufacture Davies' stardom. He founded Cosmopolitan Productions specifically to produce her films, spending over $2 million per picture, roughly $38 million today, on lavish costumes and historical sets that often overshadowed her genuine comedic talent. The logistics of this double life were managed with surgical precision. To protect Davies from the moral turpitude clauses common in film contracts of the 1920s, Hearst utilized his newspapers to suppress any mention of their relationship. Any journalist who dared to hint at the scandal was blacklisted and sued into bankruptcy. Hearst's control over the King Features Syndicate meant he could kill a story in over 2,000 newspapers with a single phone call. He also hired private investigators to monitor Davies's movements, effectively placing her in a gilded cage of constant surveillance. This monitoring extended to her physical appearance. Hearst dictated her diet, her exercise, and even the frequency of her public appearances. The secondary figures in this drama, like the gossip columnist Luella Parsons, were instrumental in the strategy. Parsons was given a lifetime contract and a massive salary to ensure that every mention of Davies in the press was glowing, reinforcing the social mask that Hearst presented to the nation. The macro context of the era, defined by the rise of the new woman and the loosening of Victorian morals, made Hearst's situation both more common and more scrutinized. While New York society viewed him with disdain for abandoning his wife, the Hollywood elite flocked to San Simeon to curry favor with the man who controlled their reviews. Every weekend, the castle hosted the 11 p.m. rule. Regardless of the festivities, all guests were expected to be in the assembly room for dinner by 9 p.m. and to retire when Hearst did, usually by midnight. The cost of entertaining these celebrities, including Charlie Chaplin, Cary Grant, and Greta Garbo, was astronomical. A single weekend's catering, which included delicacies flown in from Europe and Alaska, cost the equivalent of $110,000 in 2026 dollars. Despite the luxury, the atmosphere was often described as stifling. Davies, a naturally vivacious and gifted mimic, was forced into heavy, dramatic roles that the public rejected. A technical failure of Hearst's marketing that cost the corporation millions in losses. The friction between the two worlds reached a breaking point in the late 1920s. Millicent Hearst, refusing to grant a divorce that would result in a catastrophic financial settlement and the loss of her social status, established a separate but equal power base in New York. She leveraged the Hearst fortune for political and social influence, while Marion Davies became the de facto mistress of San Simeon. This arrangement required a delicate legal and financial balancing act. Hearst purchased a $7 million, $112 million today, beach house for Davies in Santa Monica, a 110-room Georgian colonial mansion that required a staff of 32. The property was a technical marvel of the era, featuring gold leaf ceilings and a bridge over the Pacific Coast Highway. But this extravagance was a thin veil for Davies's increasing isolation and her growing dependence on alcohol, a habit she hid from Hearst by smuggling gin in perfume bottles. The man who dictated the news to millions could not control the woman he loved, nor could he silence the whispers of a society that waited for his first major mistake. That mistake would arrive not on land, but in the dark waters off the coast of California, aboard a vessel that was meant to be a sanctuary. The Great Depression of 1929 was not merely a market correction. It was a systemic failure of the Gilded Age's leveraged reality. On Black Tuesday, October 29, 1929, the Dow Jones Industrial Average plummeted by 12%, erasing $14 billion in wealth in a single day. A catastrophe scaling to roughly $260 billion in 2026 currency. For William Randolph Hearst, the collapse was a delayed action bomb. While the American public began a decade-long descent into breadlines and Hoovervilles, Hearst's consumption remained on a trajectory of pathological expansion. He refused to acknowledge the macroeconomic reality of deflation. In 1930, while 4.5 million Americans were unemployed, Hearst was authorizing the purchase of St. Donat's Castle in Wales and continuing the reinforced concrete expansion of San Simeon. The technical logistics of his spending were now entirely divorced from the revenue of his assets. His newspapers, which relied on the advertising budgets of department stores and automotive manufacturers, saw their primary income streams evaporate as national consumer spending dropped by 45%. The technical density of his financial ruin lay in the structure of the Hearst Corporation's debt. Unlike his father, who built wealth on the extraction of physical silver, William had built an empire on credit and the projected value of future circulation. By 1931, the cost of newsprint, the physical paper upon which his lies were printed, became a crushing burden. Despite owning his own mills, the logistical cost of chemical wood pulp and the energy required for high-speed rotogravure presses remained fixed, while his ad rates plummeted. A single Sunday edition of the New York Journal, weighing nearly 2 pounds and utilizing expensive color pigments, was costing more to print and distribute than the 2 cents it fetched at the newsstand. Hearst was effectively subsidizing his own circulation to maintain the illusion of influence, a strategy that was bleeding his cash reserves at a rate of $1.5 million per month, $28 million today. This era also marked a radical shift in Hearst's political persona. Having played the role of the people's champion for 30 years, he initially supported Franklin D. Roosevelt's 18% surge in the 1932 election. However, the introduction of the New Deal and the Revenue Act of 1935 transformed Hearst into a reactionary insurgent. The act introduced a wealth tax that increased the top effective tax rate to 79%. Hearst, whose personal lifestyle required a gross annual income of at least $15 million, $280 million today, just to maintain his properties and staff, viewed this as a personal assault by the state. He used his 28 newspapers to launch a coordinated propaganda campaign against FDR, labeling the president a communist and a traitor to his class. This editorial shift alienated his core working-class readership, who were the primary beneficiaries of the New Deal's labor protections. For the first time, Hearst's papers were burned in the streets of Chicago and New York by the very people he had once manipulated. The archive curiosities of this period highlight the grotesque contrast between Hearst's world and the American reality. In 1934, while the Dust Bowl was destroying the agricultural capacity of the Great Plains, Hearst's agents were in London outbidding the National Gallery for a 14th-century Italian altarpiece. He was shipping 50 carloads of art a month to his California estate, even as the banks began to quietly install overseers within his accounting departments. Figures like Joseph Kennedy, a man who understood the technicalities of market manipulation and liquor distribution, observed Hearst's decline with predatory interest. Kennedy and other financiers realized that Hearst's empire was no longer a business. It was a sprawling, unmanageable collection of liabilities. The man who once manufactured a war to entertain a nation was now becoming a pariah, isolated by his own wealth and blinded by a refusal to pay the price of a changing world. Yet as his financial foundation crumbled, a darker shadow from his past, a secret buried in the waters of the Pacific, threatened to provide the one headline he couldn't suppress. In November 1924, the Oneida, Hearst's 220-foot steam-powered luxury yacht, set sail from San Pedro Harbor for a weekend cruise that would become the most suppressed scandal in the history of the American media. The Oneida was a masterpiece of marine engineering, built by Pusey and Jones with a steel hull and twin-screw reciprocating engines capable of 16 knots. It featured a wireless telegraph station, a professional galley, and staterooms lined in mahogany and teak. The guest list for this specific voyage included the pioneer film producer Thomas Ince, Charlie Chaplin, Marion Davies, and the gossip columnist Luella Parsons. Thomas Ince, known as the father of the Western, was a technical genius who had invented the shooting script and the assembly line method of film production. He was at the peak of his career, arriving on the yacht to celebrate his 42nd birthday and to discuss a potential business merger with Hearst's Cosmopolitan Productions. The events of Sunday, November 16th, remain obscured by a coordinated multi-state cover-up. The prevailing rumor, whispered in Hollywood for decades, suggests that Hearst, in a fit of jealous rage over an alleged affair between Charlie Chaplin and Marion Davies, attempted to shoot Chaplin. In the low light of the yacht salon, Hearst allegedly mistook Thomas Ince for Chaplin and fired a single shot into Ince's head. Technically, the logistics of what followed were handled with the efficiency of a Hearst editorial campaign. Ince was surreptitiously moved from the yacht to a train and then to his home in Beverly Hills. Despite the involvement of a gunshot wound, no police report was filed in Los Angeles or San Diego. The official cause of death was listed as acute indigestion, a medical impossibility given that Ince was a man in prime health with no history of gastric failure. The secondary characters in this cover-up were essential to its success. Luella Parsons, who was allegedly an eyewitness to the shooting, was granted a lifetime contract by the Hearst Corporation the following week. Her salary was doubled, and she was given absolute authority over the Hollywood gossip beat, a position she used for the next 40 years to protect Hearst and destroy his enemies. The macro context of the era, the Prohibition years and the Motion Picture Production Code, meant that Hollywood could not afford a scandal of this magnitude. If the most powerful media mogul in the world were convicted of murdering the most successful film producer, the entire industry would have faced a federal crackdown. Consequently, the Hollywood elite entered into a silent pact with Hearst. Ince's body was cremated with unprecedented speed, preventing any independent autopsy. The archive details reveal the chilling precision of the silence. The front pages of Hearst's Los Angeles Examiner and San Francisco Examiner on the Tuesday following Ince's death contained no mention of the incident on the Oneida. Instead, they focused on a minor fire in a local warehouse and the price of livestock. The technical suppression of the news was total. Hearst utilized his private security force, many of whom were former Pinkerton agents, to intimidate the yacht's crew into signing non-disclosure agreements that remained in effect for the rest of their lives. The cost of this silence, in terms of legal fees, bribes, and career advancements for those involved, is estimated to have exceeded $500,000 in 1924, or roughly $9.2 million in 2026 value. The Oneida incident was the moment William Randolph Hearst realized that his power was not just the ability to create the news, but the ability to delete the truth. He had successfully murdered a man and buried the evidence beneath the weight of his own empire. However, the ghost of Thomas Ince and the secret of the Oneida would linger in the subculture of Los Angeles, becoming the spiritual foundation for a screenplay that would eventually be written by a 25-year-old wunderkind. Hearst had proven he could kill a man, but he was about to learn that he could not kill a metaphor. The shadow of the yacht was merely the precursor to the cinematic execution that was coming for his soul. In early 1941, the machinery of the Hearst Corporation, which had successfully suppressed the truth of the Oneida and manipulated the start of the Spanish-American War, met its most formidable technical adversary, a 25-year-old theatrical prodigy named Orson Welles. The production of Citizen Kane was a logistical exercise in psychological warfare. Welles, backed by a silver spoon contract from RKO Radio Pictures that granted him absolute creative control, a rarity in an era of strict studio system dominance, utilized the screenplay of Herman J. Mankiewicz to dismantle Hearst's soul. Mankiewicz was a former guest at San Simeon who had observed the ray from the inside, gathering the intimate details of Hearst's vernacular, his pathological collecting, and his relationship with Marion Davies. The technical coup de grace of the film was the word Rosebud, which insiders knew was Hearst's private anatomical pet name for Marion Davies. By turning a secret of the bedroom into a public metaphor for a dying man's lost innocence, Welles committed an act of character assassination that no lawyer could litigate. The macroeconomic context of 1941 was one of global mobilization. As the United States prepared for entry into World War II, the financial stability of the RKO studio was precarious. Hearst recognized this vulnerability. He did not initially sue for libel, as a public trial would have required a discovery process that would expose his own financial skeletons and the Oneida incident to the court record. Instead, he utilized the Hearst blackout. He issued a directive to all his newspapers. No RKO film was to be reviewed, mentioned, or even included in the advertising directories. This was a technical death sentence for a studio in the 1940s, as Hearst controlled the primary marketing channels in major metropolitan hubs. To escalate the pressure, Hearst's agents approached George Schaefer, the president of RKO, with an offer to buy the negative of Citizen Kane for $800,000, approximately $16, $8 million in 2026 dollars, with the explicit intent of burning it. When the buyback failed, Hearst moved from corporate pressure to personal blackmail. He directed his information bureau to dig into the private lives of the Hollywood moguls who sat on the board of the Association of Motion Picture Producers. He threatened Louis B., mayor of MGM, and Nicholas Schenck of Rawest with the exposure of the industry's pervasive casting couch culture and the private scandals of their top stars if they did not force RKO to suppress the film. The technical logistics of this blackmail involved the use of Hearst's morgue, his massive archive of suppressed scandals, photographs, and legal documents. In 1941, the cost of an investigative campaign of this scale exceeded $150,000, $3, $1 million today, in private detective fees and hush money. Hearst was willing to bankrupt his already bleeding corporation to ensure that Welles's celluloid ghost never reached a theater. The archive curiosities of the battle reveal Hearst's desperation. He attempted to frame Orson Welles as a communist sympathizer, utilizing his ties to the FBI and J. Edgar Hoover to initiate a federal investigation into the filmmaker's subversive activities. The logistics of the smear campaign included fabricated editorials and the manipulation of the Dies Committee, the precursor to the House Un-American Activities Committee. Despite these efforts, the film premiered on May 1, 1941 at the RKO Palace Theater. Hearst succeeded in making the film a commercial failure in its initial run by denying it advertising space, but the technical innovation of the film, deep focus cinematography, non-linear narrative, and low-angle lighting ensured its immortality. Hearst had won the tactical skirmish of 1898, but in 1941 he was a man out of time. He was fighting a 19th century war of ink against a 20th century weapon of light. The media king had finally met a narrative he could not edit, and the stress of the conflict began to accelerate his own biological decay. By 1947, the man who once commanded the attention of the Western world was reduced to a set of failing biological metrics. William Randolph Hearst was suffering from progressive auricular fibrillation and congestive heart failure. The technical reality of 1940s medicine offered little more than digitalis, a compound derived from foxglove, and primitive oxygen tents to manage his condition. He was no longer the master of San Simeon. He was its most expensive liability. Under the strict orders of his physician, Dr. Myron Prince Metal, Hearst was forced to abandon his Cuesta Encantada because the 1,600-foot altitude and the 45-minute drive to the nearest hospital in San Luis Obispo were deemed life-threatening. He was moved to a relatively modest, by his standards, 12-bedroom mansion at 1007 North Beverly Drive in Beverly Hills, a property owned by Marion Davies. The macro context of the post-war era was the final nail in the coffin of the individual, barren model of power. The Hearst Corporation was now effectively managed by a board of trustees and the Schern Committee, who viewed Hearst's presence as a hindrance to the restructuring required to pay off his massive debts. The technical liquidation of the Hearst collection became one of the largest transfers of cultural property in history. In a desperate move to generate liquidity, Hearst was forced to sell his treasures through Gimbel's department store in New York. Between 1941 and 1948, over 100,000 items, including 15th century Spanish cloisters, Egyptian sarcophagi, and English silver, were sold to the public at discounted prices. The logistics were surreal. A housewife could buy a medieval wood carving for $15, $180 today, next to a display of kitchen appliances. Hearst, who had spent a lifetime treating art as the fortification of his ego, watched from his bed as his empire was dismantled and sold as department store novelties. The physical decline was accompanied by a descent into acute paranoia and social isolation. Hearst's world shrank to the dimensions of a single master suite, where he was surrounded by banks of telephones and a teletype machine that kept him connected to his editors. He continued to dictate editorials until his voice became a rasping whisper. The technical maintenance of his life required a 24-hour nursing staff and a pharmacy room stocked with the latest stimulants and sedatives. He became obsessed with the information age he had helped create, terrified that his rivals were using the same techniques of wiretapping and surveillance against him that he had used against others. He frequently ordered his security staff to sweep the Beverly Hills mansion for microphones, convinced that the Roosevelt administration or the ghost of Thomas Ince was listening to his labored breathing. The secondary characters of this final act, particularly Marion Davies, underwent a transformation from mistresses to wardens. Davies, despite her own struggles with alcoholism, became the primary guardian of Hearst's remaining dignity. She controlled who could see him, often turning away his own sons to protect the image of the king. The archive details of his final year are somber. Hearst's daily routine consisted of reading the morning editions of his own newspapers and marking them with a red pencil, though the editors increasingly ignored his notations. His last major purchase was not a castle or a masterpiece, but a specialized orthopedic bed designed to prevent the fluid buildup in his lungs. In 1951, as the world moved into the era of television and the Cold War, Hearst was a relic of a discarded age, trapped in a gilded cage of his own making, waiting for the one event he had forbidden his staff to ever mention in his presence. On August 14, 1951, the biological clock of William Randolph Hearst finally ceased its mechanical progression. He was 88 years old. The end occurred at 9:50 a.m. in the North Beverly Drive mansion, a Mediterranean-style villa that served as his final bunker. Technically, his death was attributed to a cerebral hemorrhage following years of atrial fibrillation, but the clinical reality was a total systemic failure of a body that had outlived its era. The room was sterile, equipped with the latest medical monitoring technology of the early 1950s, a stark contrast to the medieval tapestries Hearst had spent his life accumulating. In his final hours, he was surrounded not by the kings and queens of his newspapers, but by a rotating shift of private nurses and the constant rhythmic hiss of an oxygen concentrator. The immediate aftermath of his death was a masterclass in corporate coldness and legal precision. While Marion Davies, the woman who had been his companion for over 3 decades, was sedated in another wing of the house, Hearst's 5 sons and their legal representatives moved with surgical efficiency. Within hours of his pulse stopping, his body was removed from the premises and transported to a mortuary. When Davies woke, she found the house empty of both the man she loved and the primary symbols of his presence. The technicality of the law was absolute. Because they were never married, she had no legal standing in the house she herself technically owned, but had allowed Hearst to occupy. She was informed by the Hearst family lawyers that she was not welcome at the funeral, and that the private security detail, which she had paid for, was now under the command of the Hearst Corporation trustees. The macroeconomic context of August 1951 was dominated by the Korean War and the tightening grip of the Cold War, yet the death of Hearst commanded the front pages of every major publication globally, except ironically for a few hours in his own papers, which struggled with the logistics of an obituary they had prepared and updated for 20 years. The funeral was held at Grace Cathedral in San Francisco, an Episcopal landmark of Gothic revival architecture that echoed the aesthetics of San Simeon. The technical cost of the funeral, including the copper-lined casket and the elaborate floral arrangements shipped from across the state, exceeded $35,000, a sum scaling to approximately $430,000 in 2026 currency. It was a state-level event attended by governors, mayors, and the titans of the old guard, many of whom had spent their careers fearing the man they were now burying. The technical layer of his will revealed the structural fragility of his empire. Hearst's estate was valued at $59.5 million, $735 million today, but the vast majority of this was tied up in non-liquid assets, real estate, and art. To satisfy the inheritance tax laws of the 1950s, which levied rates as high as 77% on estates of this magnitude, the trustees had to initiate a massive restructuring of the Hearst Corporation. The legacy of his silver spoon was divided among his 5 sons, George, William Jr., John, Randolph, and David, none of whom possessed their father's singular obsessive drive or his tolerance for financial risk. The man who had spent his life mining the public's attention was now being mined himself by the Internal Revenue Service and a board of directors determined to sanitize his image. The era of the press baron ended not with a headline, but with a series of quiet signatures in a mahogany row boardroom. As his casket was lowered into the family crypt at Cypress Lawn Memorial Park, The cycle of power Hearst had initiated in 1887 was complete. He had entered the world of media as an insurgent with a fortune built on silver and left it as a relic in a world of television and nuclear anxiety. The final irony was that the woman he had spent millions to elevate, Marion Davies, was forced to watch the proceedings from a distance, barred from the family plot. The king was dead, and the new administrators of his kingdom were already planning how to turn his monuments of ego into tax-deductible donations. The afterlife of the Hearst Empire is a study in the archaeology of excess. By 1958, the Hearst Corporation, unable to justify the astronomical maintenance costs of San Simeon, which had ballooned to the equivalent of $12 million annually in 2026 dollars, donated La Cuesta Encantada and its primary contents to the state of California. It became the Hearst San Simeon State Historical Monument. This was not a gesture of philanthropy, but a technical necessity to avoid the ruinous property taxes and upkeep of 115 rooms and 250,000 acres of remote coastline. Today, the castle serves as a museum where over 700,000 tourists a year pay for the privilege of walking through a manufactured reality. The technical preservation of the site is an ongoing industrial effort. The saltwater air of the Pacific constantly erodes the 20th century concrete and the 15th century limestone, requiring a permanent staff of masons and conservators that mirrors the army Hearst employed during construction. The macro legacy of William Randolph Hearst is the blueprint for the modern media industrial complex. While his physical newspapers have dwindled in number, the Hearst Corporation remains a global titan, with 360 businesses ranging from A&E Networks and ESPN to Fitch Ratings. The technical transition from yellow journalism to algorithmic engagement is a direct evolution of Hearst's discovery that emotion drives circulation more effectively than fact. The strategy he pioneered in the 1890s, the creation of echo chambers, the use of sensationalist headlines to drive political outcomes, and the vertical integration of content is now the standard operating procedure for every digital conglomerate on the planet. He did not just report the news, he invented the mechanics of the information age, where the truth is a secondary byproduct of the search for dominance. Secondary figures associated with his name continued to populate the American mythos. Most notably, his granddaughter, Patricia Hearst, would become the face of 1970s radicalism after her kidnapping by the Symbionese Liberation Army, a bizarre echoing of the sensationalist crime of the century headlines her grandfather once used to sell papers. Julia Morgan, the architect who spent 28 years translating Hearst's whims into stone, was posthumously awarded the AIA Gold Medal in 2014, finally receiving technical recognition for the engineering marvel that is San Simeon. Meanwhile, the art collection Hearst spent billions to acquire remains scattered across the globe. Hundreds of pieces are still being identified in museum basements, and the warehouses in the Bronx that once held entire dismantled Spanish monasteries are now symbols of a defunct era of private curation. The ruins of Hearst's empire are not just made of stone. They are made of the very way we perceive the world. Citizen Kane, the film he tried to destroy, is now universally cited as the greatest cinematic achievement in history, ensuring that Hearst's private failures are studied by every student of film. He wanted to be remembered as a statesman and a builder of nations. Instead, he is remembered as the prototype for the mad media mogul. The technical reality of his life was the pursuit of total control over time and space through the accumulation of objects and the manipulation of minds. In the end, he achieved a form of immortality, but it was not the one he intended. He became a warning rather than a hero, a monument to the fact that power, when untethered from reality, eventually consumes its architect. The Cuesta Encantada stands today as a silent limestone witness to the transience of the Gilded Age. The zebras that once belonged to his private zoo still roam the hills of San Simeon, descendants of the original captives, wild but out of place, a living archive of a man who tried to buy nature itself. William Randolph Hearst built a castle to hide the fact that, in a world made of ink and paper, the only thing that cannot be printed is eternity. The ultimate truth of the media king is that the more a man tries to own the narrative of history, the more he becomes a prisoner of its footnotes. William Randolph Hearst spent $1 billion to build a world he could control, only to realize that the ink dries, the stone crumbles, and the truth, no matter how deeply buried, always finds its way to the front page.